What's up, guys? This is Chit Chat with Joshua. Today will be the first video in the playlist for political economy over the centuries. So today's video will be more about me giving a bit of an introduction to this topic, how politicians and economists differ, a little background on the 2008 financial crisis and like the different reasons that caused it, as well as the different solutions that countries around the world took in attempts to minimize its effect on their nation's economy. And finally, I'll be moving on to what is called the twin experiment, where economists use the twin experiment to help them compare different policies across similar countries to see which policy is more effective and could possibly be used to better their own country. So firstly, I think I'll start off with how politicians and economists really differ. So I would say that politicians and economists differ on like three pretty clear areas. So firstly, I would mention that politicians and economists, they differ in terms of their statements, like how they talk in public. Do they use normative or do they use positive statements? For instance, a politician would typically use normative statements, which tend to be more subjective and with less substantial like evidence behind it, while economists tend to use positive statements, which are objective and can be statistically proven. So this is typically because politicians also play on the people's feelings and emotions, so they use more subjective language to evoke an emotion from the public, so as to gain a stronger support for their political agenda. Second, I would say that politicians also tend not to account for opportunity cost. So, when I say opportunity cost, what opportunity cost is the cost of any action or decision measured in terms of the next best alternative foregone. So, like, what would you be gaining or losing if you implemented another policy as opposed to policy A? So, the opportunity cost is typically not taken into account by your average politician. However, economists, whose whole job scope, is about making rational decisions where they weigh costs and benefits of any action or decision, and choose the one to maximize, their aims. They typically take into account opportunity costs and try and measure it in substantial quantitative measures. So they try and convert it to monetary terms. This allows them to make a more detailed analysis about the policies and potentially choose the better policy as opposed to a typical politician. Finally, there's a difference between economic policy and economic theory. So there's a number of jokes across the internet and in academia where you can never ask an economist for what policy to implement to tackle a particular situation, because they will continuously repeat on the other hand, or however, to give theses and antitheses for any particular stand they may have on an issue. On the other hand, the politician will typically have a single policy which they're confident in will be able to address an issue. So now that you guys know the difference, right? The difference that I see in terms of economists and a politician with regards to policy making, I'll be moving on to the 2008 financial crisis and how it's affected different nations around the world and how different nations have addressed it. So basically, right, prior to 2008, prior to the financial crisis, there was about 15 years of economic growth, economic boom, where there was falling unemployment and low inflation. So the economy is very stable, and it was believed that at that point, the optimal set of policies to nurture or to ensure growth in the economy had been found. I mean, 15 years of growth is quite substantial, right? So governments across the globe were certain in their macro policies and believed that they chose the optimal ones. These policies typically entailed deregulation and liberalizing the private sector to where there's increased competition in the sector and allowing companies in financial sector to have a great degree of freedom with regards to their dealings. However, 15 years of good economic prospects lead to speculative expenditure. So what does speculative expenditure really mean, right? What do I mean by speculative expenditure? But really all it means is that after 15 years of growth, 15 years of increase in GDP, rising income levels, citizens and even businessmen become used to this sort of life, where they expect that future prices will continue to increase and profits will continue to increase in the future. As such, this leads to a speculative bubble where people expect it's going to get better, it's going to get better, it's going to get even better, until eventually it pops, because people realize that they are overestimating, or their expectations on the future is overly optimistic. At this point, the speculative bubble will pop, and it will have devastating effects on the nation's economy. On top of this, right, to make matters worse, other than just speculative expenditure, speculative investments, there was also mass deregulation of financial institutes, where due to deregulation, right, with limited limitations on who they can give their loans out to, these financial institutes gave out loans rapidly, like very freely, with limited deterrence. Really, they just gave out loans, so often taking on bad debt, where they gave out loans to individuals or companies which were making losses and actually would not be able to repay their debt. So this was like the financial institutes' willingness to do this was aided by the speculative bubble, where you just expected the economy to continue to grow and get better. So essentially, by giving out bad loans, it just ultimately led to companies and individuals defaulting on loans. So bad debt, where individuals and businesses were unable to pay back their debts, resulting in the banks actually losing money from their investments. So from these two issues, right, it gave rise to the 2008 financial crisis, which plagued first America and went on to plague the global economy due to the world being increasingly globalized and interconnected, with special relation to their economy. To address this, around the world there was a three-pronged strategy, to help address the financial crisis. So how should I begin? So there were different policies undertaken by different nations, where no one nation took up all the policies. So for instance, when the 2008 financial crisis came around, economists looked back to their history to see what policies had worked to bring nations out of economic crash or depression. So immediately, many economists looked to the 1929, when the Great Depression hit the world. So it was found that from 1930, right, it was found that the majority of the slumps in economic history, as well as 1939, was due to a fall in monetary supply, where there was a lack of money circulation, lack of money supply and money circulation in the economy, which ultimately just led to rapid appreciation and fall in the nation's net exports. Because, well, if the currency appreciates, right, it means that for locals, their currency is stronger and they can buy more imports. Imports have become cheaper. Foreign imports have become cheaper. While for foreigners, right, buying our goods is actually more expensive now. So when goods become more expensive, people become deterred and less willing and able to buy goods. So there's a fall in demand. So ultimately, with foreign goods becoming cheaper for us, when our currency appreciates, our demand increases. So there's increase in imports, and there's a fall in exports because our goods cost more to the average foreigner. So a fall in our exports and an increase in our imports ultimately results in a fall in our net trade, and in turn affects our aggregate demand, right? So, and results in a fall in actual growth in the economy, which can help foster economic crash or recession. So so actually this reasoning was actually like a solution to this was argued for by monetarists like Milton Friedman, who was like the father of monetarism in monetarism solution in economics. So the solution that in 2008 some economists monetarists came up with, right, was that to prevent the rapid appreciation where there's a small supply of money, just pump money into the economy. print money, print a lot of money, pump in the economy, as well as by providing more money to the banks from central bank, they'll be more willing to lend, to consumers and producers, which would in turn ultimately lead to economic growth, because these individuals would have more money, they're more willing to spend, and spending makes the economy grow. So that's one aspect of that particular policy, the monetary policy. The other aspect was quantitative easing, which is basically where the government buys many banks buy many long-term government debts like bonds and shares, as well as property, while the banks also slash the interest rates to like 0% to make taking loans much more enticing. So this did have its intended effect, of increasing funds available for the public, and making credit more easily available to firms and businesses. But the negative effect of this is that massive increase in monetary supply could actually lead to depreciation, right, where your currency actually becomes weaker, right? And depreciation would actually affect your nation's inflation rates in terms of cost of production, and even in terms of wages. So because of depreciation, it gives rise to a risk of rapid inflation in the nation, which would destroy the effect. Would erode the value of currency, would ultimately would make many people become poor overnight. So that was a real risk from this monetary policy. So something that economists had to watch carefully over. Another negative effect, right, of this monetary policy was that there was increased income inequality, right, because assets was worth more due to assets which typically owned by the richer percentage of a population were in greater demand by central bank, who were willing to who had a greater desire, greater demand, greater wish to spend their increased monetary supply on bonds and shares. So this resulted in greater income inequality, where there's greater income gap and income difference between the top 1% and bottom 1% in the nation. Another policy that was implemented by nations around the world was demand management by the government, where due to when the economy crashed, right, and citizens were less willing and less able to spend money to buy goods and services, and firms as well were less willing able to spend money to purchase goods and services. It was up to the government to make up the difference. So there was increased government expenditure on public goods and services, such as infrastructure like roads and hospitals and schools, where the government just spent money to make up the difference, so that the economy's actual growth would be minimally affected. However, while this did have the intended effect of reducing the impact on the fall in the nation's aggregate demand, it had another effect, which was can be seen as negative, where the nation had a rising debt to GDP ratio. So with the nation having rising debt, it results in foreigners losing confidence in the nation, and making it more difficult for a nation to acquire further loans from IMF and World Bank in the future, because there was greater risk that the nation would be declare bankruptcy, and where the nation would experience a sovereign debt crisis. So with this increased risk in the future, the willingness of institutions like World Bank to lend to these nations with greater debt would fall. However, at that time, it was seen as a negative that the country can sustain, because the priority was simply to get the nation out of financial crisis, regardless of a potentially ballooning debt. Another policy that was implemented. To elaborate a bit more, right? The first policy I mentioned about the monetarist policy was argued for by monetarists like Milton Friedman. The second one about demand management, where the government just made up the difference in demand by spending more, argued for by people like Keynes. It was argued for by people Keynesians, I guess you could call them, who subscribe to John Keynes's economic philosophy. And thirdly, there's another group of people who, I guess you call them Austrians, right? Whose policy was to simply just neutralize bad loans. Questionable projects and bad debt was simply just written off, where banks accepted that they would not be making the money back, that they had taken a loss, and simply wrote it off as a loss and moved on in their life. It's time to rebuild and just ignore losses and just time to rebuild. This was a policy typically implemented by Austrians and was more prevalent in the Scandinavian countries. So with these different policies, right, being implemented by nations around the world, and with these being options for all nations, certain nations chose certain policies which they believe would be more effective in their particular economy. Example, Scandinavian countries were more receptive to the Austrian policy I mentioned before, and it turned out that post 2008 financial crisis, the Scandinavian countries actually did better by using the Austrian policies than nations who did not, like Japan, who till now are fighting a burdening debt level due to the mass expenditure during the financial crisis. That is a quick, really heavy crash course, I would say, on the financial crisis, 2008 financial crisis. So lastly, I'll now be discussing the twins experiment, which is very commonly used by economists around the world in terms of their, for the evaluation of policies. So for economists, right, one common way of comparing the effectiveness of policies is to look at the effectiveness of policies between two nations which are historically similar in terms of the economics and point of interest, and looking at the point of interest where they diverged. So an example would be Korea. Korea was once a unified nation, prior to the Korean War in 1952, I think. Post-Korean War, it was separated into a, autocratic dictatorship, North Korea, as compared to a democratic South Korea, where the living standards, quality of life in South Korea rapidly rose, while those in North Korea have still been substantially lower than their South Korean counterparts. Another comparison commonly seen is East and West Germany, prior to the Berlin Wall collapse, so during the Cold War. After World War II, Germany was separated into different segments where the Allies and France, US, as well as Russia took control and took governance over certain segments of Germany. So they used this opportunity to expand their sphere of influence, export their sort of culture and their political ideologue, which is basically where the war between communism and democracy began. So prior to the division of Germany into East and West Germany, Germany was one unified country, but subsequently they began to diverge in terms of their economic prospects and their quality of life prior to the Berlin Wall falling in 1991, I believe. Another common comparison, right, would be Australia and Argentina. It's even, actually, that comparison is still used today, right? The comparison between Australia and Argentina. Because both nations prior to World War I were booming economies, rich in raw materials and raw materials like metals, which they exported to make large amounts of money for their nation. Both nations enjoyed massive foreign direct investments from richer Western powers, and both nations had comparable standard of living measured in terms of life expectancy, education, healthcare, as well as stuff like leisure time that the citizens possess. Today, 100 years after World War I, Australia is considered a rich nation, a well-developed one as well, where they've industrialized and made substantial amount of money from the manufacturing sector as well. They've moved on from the primary sector of agriculture, and they industrialized and even moved into the financial sector, making themselves a substantial amount of money, and have propelled Australia into a first world nation on the global stage. However, Argentina did not find as much success. Argentina remains a developing nation with high levels of inflation, high levels of unemployment, and are plagued by recessions frequently. This was reasoning for this in Argentina, right, the reasoning for the difference between Australia and Argentina is fundamentally due to the differences in macro policy implemented by their leaders. So, example, in Argentina, they had a populist leader, Juan Perón, who was elected for his popular beliefs, and he implemented a protectionist, nationalist policy, right, which ultimately led to inefficiency and absence of global free trade to connect to Argentina. So despite certain companies and industries doing horrendously, being sunset industries where they were no longer booming and were on the downhill, their best days were behind them. Despite this being the case, these industries were still being protected by this populist dictator, and ultimately led to inefficiency where there was wastage of resources. Resources could have been used more productively in sunrise industries, booming industries, but instead, due to reprehensible policies implemented by this populist dictator, Argentina still today remains a developing nation. So guys, that's it for the first episode, for the first video on political economy, a passage through time. We went through a crash course on how politicians and economists vary in their beliefs and their approaches to legislature, as well as a breakdown of the financial crisis, what caused the financial crisis, different sort of strategies that different nations around the world implemented, as well as looking at the twins experiment, which is very commonly used by economists to evaluate policies they wish to implement in nations. So guys, I appreciate you all watching this video. Like, subscribe, share, comment on what you guys think, and I look forward to posting another video which will be on US founding father General Alexander Hamilton, and about his policies and beliefs, which I will expand upon further in the next video. That's all. Till next time.